I think it's very few countries. I think so. Definitely, you think some of the key markets in our region definitely regulated, right? So there's some Australia, New Zealand is an area where it is regulated, and as I think in that market as well, self-regulation is also very, very strong. I think that we have a lot of companies in this industry who are very professional, and they self-regulate far above and beyond anything a government would want to do. But in any industry, you have new entrants, you have companies who have different practices that break in. So I think if you kind of cut across, you say, well, it is self-regulated in Asia Pacific in general, as a saying, but you say in some of our key markets, Australia, New Zealand, you're seeing a different trend. You see that in Europe as well, and you see it in North America as well. So the telemarketing guidelines in Singapore was actually something that came up a few years ago when I was the vice chairman of the Contact Center Association here in Singapore. And the Monetary Authority of Singapore actually reached out to us and says, you're the authority, the body in Singapore that understands the contact center industry, and we would like to work with you to see how we can create a framework for self-regulation in Singapore so that we don't have to go in and legislate. And I think the modus operandi at that time for MAS, as they're called, was that we don't really understand it. So if we go in and legislate it, we may actually legislate it the wrong way and limit opportunity or not do it thoroughly. So we as an organization at that time in CCAS basically built a working group that consisted of representatives from all sides of the financial industry in Singapore, whether it was the insurance industry, the agents, or the banks and trading houses. And over a long period, we basically sounded out different angles on how we can create a framework that works so that it is, firstly, it's easy to self-regulate because it's clear-cut what you can and you shouldn't do, and what are the recourse for consumers in case that somebody breaches the guidelines. And we got everyone to sign up for it, so the Bankers Association, IFPAS, and similarly in Singapore signed on to it, and it was launched a few years ago. What it has done, and I think what we've seen initially, it actually was created a lot of interest from the consumers in Singapore, and people would reach out and say, how does this work? How do I get on a do not call list? And I think one of the first requirements that was in there was actually that financial institution in Singapore has to have a do not call list. And if somebody requests to come on that do not call list, you cannot call them. What is the recourse for a consumer who has a complaint? You can contact the association in Singapore, who would evaluate, and ultimately, if it's deemed serious enough or multiple breaches, it would be referred to MAS for further action. And there's a department in MAS that looks after these things, right? So I think that worked pretty well. I think that definitely there has been breaches of it, even blue chip companies, because it required a new process. And I think that the risk you have with self-regulation is that I may not have invested in the technology to run a do not call list. So in some instances, in some of the banks in the early days, it was done via Excel. And when there's human element in it, flaws happen. And so I think most of the companies in the financial industry that breached the guidelines did so out of human flaw, not of malice, not because they say, we don't care. And I don't think there has been any breaches that were nothing but human flaw. But that said, I think still a pet peeve for the consumer in Singapore is, I say I want to be on a do not call list. How come I'm still called? I know that in general, I think when we talk to some of the companies in the industry, we're saying, we're supposed to do business. And I think ultimately it is coming to understanding that said, for a consumer, if a consumer in a market says, don't call me, don't call them. We're anyhow in a world today where we're so multimodal, and there's so much different avenues of communications with the consumer. Traditional marketing, television, direct mail, emails, advertising on the web, and similarly, so that I don't think we need to necessarily always call them aggressively. So I think you will see in the coming years, perhaps, you would see a continued push from the consumer to saying, hey, honor, do not call. And you would see definitely, I think most of the big financial institutions in Singapore are honoring that and having a do not call list. For telemarketing agencies that may contravene these guidelines, you might see stricter enforcement from the public sector simply because of what has transpired with the financial downturn here in Singapore in the last few years.